Naval Corvus. Rome had no navy, so it invented a way to fight on water without needing one. In 260 BC, Carthage controlled the Mediterranean with the most skilled and battle-hardened naval force in the world. Rome had just built a fleet from scratch, reportedly copying a captured Carthaginian warship as a template, and its sailors were largely untrained. In any standard naval engagement involving ramming and open water maneuvering, Rome would lose. So Roman engineers invented the Corvus, a spiked boarding bridge 36 feet long, mounted on a rotating pole fixed to the prow of each ship. When an enemy vessel came within range, the bridge dropped. The iron spike drove through the enemy deck and locked both ships together, immovably. The Carthaginians, expecting a battle of speed and seamanship, suddenly found Roman infantry crossing a bridge onto their decks. The battle instantly became a land fight on water, and in land battles, Rome was the finest fighting force in the world. At Mylae in 260 BC, the Carthaginian admiral led 130 ships into engagement, certain that Roman inexperience at sea would be decisive. The first 30 ships to close with the Roman line were hooked, boarded, and seized within minutes, including the flagship. He fled in a small boat to escape his own captured deck. Rome seized 31 ships and sank 14 more. Rome celebrated its first naval victory by erecting a column in the Forum, decorated with the bronze prows of captured Carthaginian ships. Caesar's Rhine Bridge. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar looked at one of the widest, deepest, fastest-moving rivers in Europe and decided to build a bridge across it in 10 days, as a battle tactic. Germanic tribes had been raiding across the Rhine, using the river as a natural boundary behind which they felt untouchable. Caesar's allies offered boats to cross. Caesar refused. Boats were adequate. Crossing by boats was what a weaker force did. Caesar intended to demonstrate something specific, that Rome could cross the Rhine at will, and could build a permanent road across the most formidable natural barrier in the region faster than the Germans could believe was possible. His engineers drove paired wooden piles into the riverbed using pile drivers mounted on rafts. The paired piles were braced with crossbeams, angled against the current so that the force of the flowing water actually increased the structure's stability with every surge. Additional angled piles upstream acted as debris deflectors, protecting the bridge from anything the river or the enemy might send against it. The entire structure was operational in 10 days. Caesar marched his entire army across, burned villages and crops for 18 days, then demolished the bridge on the way back. 2 years later, to ensure no one had forgotten, Caesar returned and built a second one, the Pilum. The Roman soldier began killing 20 feet away from the opponent. Each legionary carried 2 pila, heavy javelins roughly 6 to 7 feet long, with a wooden shaft and a long, thin iron shank ending in a hardened pyramidal point. As the opposing formation closed at a run, the Romans launched coordinated volleys at 50 to 60 feet. When the Pilum struck an enemy shield, the heavy iron shank drove through it and bent. The soft iron was designed to deform on impact. This meant the enemy soldier could not pull it out, could not cut it free, and could not throw it back. A shield with a bent 6-foot-long pilum hanging from it became impossible to hold up. Most soldiers simply dropped them, arriving at the Roman sword line shieldless, exposed, and already disorganized. A pilum through the shield of the man beside them would pin 2 shields together, tangling both men at the exact moment the Roman infantry drew their swords. At Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar ordered a unit of his infantry to use their pila as thrusting spears, stabbing upward at the faces of Pompey's elite cavalry, who were bearing down at full charge. The cavalry, trained to overwhelm infantry in open formation, was completely unprepared for a wall of iron points aimed at their eyes. They broke and fled within seconds. That single adaptation of one weapon unraveled Pompey's entire battle plan. Testudo. The arrows were coming from above. You didn't stop walking. You didn't raise your shield. You waited for the order. And when it came, everything around you transformed in seconds. When Roman legions approached an enemy fortification under a hail of missiles, the commander called a single order, Testudinum formate, form the tortoise. In seconds, the formation transformed. Soldiers at the front locked their massive rectangular shields vertically from shin to eye level, creating a solid wall of overlapping iron. The men behind them lifted their shields horizontally overhead, overlapping them like tiles on a roof. The soldiers on the flanks and rear did the same, facing outward. The formation sealed on all sides. There was no exposed surface to strike. From the outside, it was eerie to watch. The entire formation moved in lockstep, pressed shoulder to shoulder, shields clicking into place above them. Roman commanders sometimes tested the strength of the locked formation by driving carts over it. The Testudo was used primarily in sieges, where troops had to cross open ground under fire and reach the base of a wall to plant battering rams. During Mark Antony's Parthian campaign in 36 BC, the Parthian cavalry charged expecting a broken line. The Romans dropped to one knee, absorbed the attack behind a wall of shields, then sprang up and hurled their javelins forward. The cavalry was routed before it could do damage. The moment the arrows stopped, the Romans broke formation and finished the fight with sword and shield, under a sky full of arrows. A formation of men had moved like a single armored animal. Triple line. The Samnites had humiliated Rome at the Caudine Forks in 321 BC, trapping an entire Roman army in a mountain pass and forcing them to surrender without a single sword being drawn. The lesson was absorbed. Rome responded with the Aces Triplex, a rolling system of staged pressure built to outlast anything an enemy could throw at it. At the front, the Hastati, the youngest, most aggressive soldiers. Before contact, the Velites, Rome's light skirmishers, ran ahead and hurled javelins into the enemy formation to disrupt it, then retreated back through the gaps as the Hastati advanced. When the Hastati locked with the enemy, they pushed hard to break the opposing line. If they started to fail, they withdrew through the gaps in the formation. The Principes, more experienced, better armored soldiers who had been watching and resting, charged through the opening into the same enemy who had just thought they were winning. If even the Principes could not prevail, the Triarii rose. Veterans, armed with long spears, men who had fought campaigns for decades. There was a saying in Rome, "It has to come to the Triarii." It meant the situation was desperate. When the Triarii stood up, the enemy understood that every soldier Rome had sent before them had been a warm-up. In most battles, it never came to that. Most enemies never got to see the Triarii. Knowing they existed was enough. Wedge Formation. The wedge didn't break an enemy line. It split it in half. The Cuneus, named after the wooden tool used to split logs, arranged the most experienced soldiers packed tight at a pointed front, with the mass of the formation widening behind them. The physics were direct, and narrow points concentrating enormous force drove into the enemy line at its weakest spot. As the tip penetrated, it widened the gap, and the mass behind pressed through, splitting the enemy formation into two disorganized halves that could be attacked simultaneously from the sides. To counter it, an enemy needed a formation capable of collapsing inward and wrapping around the point, which required exactly the kind of drill and discipline that Rome's enemies almost never possessed. At Watling Street in AD 61, the Roman commander Suetonius Paulinus faced Boudicca's army, an estimated 100,000 Britons against roughly 10,000 Romans. He placed his legions at the end of a narrow gorge, forcing the Britons to funnel in. The Romans held still. Then came two coordinated volleys of pila that tore through the packed British front ranks. Then the wedges drove in. The Britons couldn't maneuver in the narrow space. Their warriors were pinned against each other, unable to swing their weapons. Roman swords worked in tight, short stabs, exactly what the gladius was built for. A force 10 times the size of the Roman army was destroyed by shape. Siege warfare. When Rome could not break a city with its army, it surrounded the city until the city destroyed itself. The moment a city was designated for siege, engineers constructed a continuous fortified wall with towers, encircling the city entirely, facing inward to trap the defenders. At Alesia in 52 BC, Caesar simultaneously built a second outer wall facing outward to stop a relief army from breaking in. He trapped Vercingetorix's 80,000 Gauls inside, then held off a relief force of 250,000 from the outside, while his own 50,000 men were sandwiched between two massive Gallic forces. He built the walls faster than either enemy could respond. He won. Inside the siege perimeter, catapults and bolt throwers shattered walls and destroyed water sources. Legionaries advanced under the Testudo formation to plant battering rams. Siege towers taller than the enemy walls carried ramps that dropped directly onto the battlements, allowing soldiers to flood over. Teams of soldiers dug tunnels beneath the foundations to collapse towers from below. The Romans attacked walls, gates, foundations, and morale simultaneously, never allowing the defenders a single quiet moment to organize. The real weapon was starvation. At the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, conditions inside became so extreme that defenders consumed leather, and according to accounts, the dead. The city fell because nothing human can outlast a Roman siege. Double envelopment. Rome learned this tactic the hardest way possible, by being destroyed by it. At Cannae in 216 BC, Approximately 86,000 Roman and Allied soldiers were encircled by a smaller army, and between 55,000 and 70,000 died in a single afternoon. They could barely raise their swords. Roman commanders read the retreating Carthaginian center as breakthrough and ordered the push harder. The legions compressed into a tighter and tighter mass, stripping away their own ability to fight. By the time the flanks folded inward and the cavalry sealed the rear, the Romans had already defeated themselves. Casualties included a sitting consul, 2 former consuls, 29 of 48 military tribunes, and roughly a third of the Roman Senate. Over the following 14 years, Roman commanders dissected what had gone wrong. The disaster at Cannae came from a formation that could not adapt once compressed. The traditional checkerboard spacing of maniples, Rome's flexible unit blocks, became useless the moment the men lost room to maneuver. Rome identified the problem precisely. They had given the enemy a center to push against without protecting their own flanks and rear. At Zama in 202 BC, Scipio Africanus built a battle that answered every lesson Cannae had taught. He realigned his maniples into open corridors to channel Hannibal's war elephants through, rather than absorbing their impact. He secured the Numidian cavalry, the same allies Hannibal had used at Cannae, and gave them one mission: clear the flanks and return. He drove his infantry into Hannibal's veterans to pin them in place. The breakthrough was never the point. When the cavalry completed its loop and hit from the rear, Hannibal's army had nowhere to go. Carthage sued for peace within the year. Rome had taken 14 years, one catastrophic defeat, and the near destruction of its republic, and turned it into a tactical doctrine that ended a war in an afternoon.